Elias Barton found the bear cub half frozen and starving at the edge of his woods on a bitter morning in early spring, and against every ounce of good sense he had, he picked it up, carried it home, and raised it in secret. The folks in Timber Falls would have called him a dangerous old fool if they'd known, but Elias had never much cared what folks thought, and that decision, made on a cold spring morning, would give him the most extraordinary friendship of his entire life. Elias was a solitary man, and he liked it that way. He was in his early 70s, a widower who'd lost his wife a decade before and had no children to speak of. He farmed a remote spread at the very edge of the great pine forest that stretched north for 100 miles, and his nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the road. Elias spent his days working his land and his evenings alone by the fire, and he'd made his peace with the quiet. The forest was his closest companion, and he knew it the way other men knew their own kin, every trail, every creek, every creature that moved through it. It was on one of his morning walks along the tree line that he found the cub, a tiny black bear, no bigger than a house cat, curled in the snow at the base of a great pine, shivering, mewling weakly, and clearly near death. Elias knew at once what had happened. He'd heard a week before that a hunter had shot a female bear in these woods, not knowing she had a cub. This was that cub, orphaned, abandoned, and slowly freezing and starving to death alone in the cold. Now Elias knew the sensible thing. A wild bear cub was no business of a farmer's. It would grow into a large and dangerous animal. Every scrap of practical wisdom told him to leave it to nature and walk on. But Elias looked down at that tiny, dying creature, so small and so alone in the vast, cold world, and he found he simply could not do it. "You and me both, little one," he murmured, thinking of his own solitary life, orphaned and alone. "Well, maybe we can keep each other company a while," and he took off his coat and wrapped the cub in it and carried it home. He named it Bruno. Elias knew he had to keep it a secret. Folks in Timber Falls would never understand. They'd be frightened, and rightly so, and someone would surely insist the animal be taken away or destroyed. So Elias told no one. He raised Bruno in his barn at the edge of his remote farm where no one ever came. He fed the cub warm milk from a bottle through those first fragile weeks, wakened through the night to tend him just as a mother would, and slowly, miraculously, the dying cub grew strong. The two of them became inseparable. Bruno followed the old farmer everywhere, tumbling after him through the fields, dozing at his feet by the fire in the evenings, growing bigger and stronger with each passing season. Elias, who had been so alone for so long, found his quiet life suddenly full of warmth and mischief and companionship. He talked to Bruno the way he'd once talked to his wife, telling him about his day, his memories, his thoughts, and the bear, in his way, seemed to understand. There was an intelligence in his dark eyes, and a gentleness, and a deep and unmistakable love for the old man who had saved him. But Elias knew, even as he cherished every day of it, that it could not last forever. Bruno was a wild creature, and he was growing. Soon he'd be a full-grown black bear, hundreds of pounds of wild animal, and no barn or farm could rightly hold such a thing. More than that, Elias knew that Bruno deserved to be what he was born to be. A bear belonged in the forest, wild and free, not tucked away on a farm as an old man's secret companion. And so, though it broke his heart to think of it, Elias began, from the time Bruno was small, to prepare him for the day he'd have to let him go. He took Bruno on long walks deep into the forest, teaching him its ways. He showed him where the berries grew and the fish ran, let him learn to forage and to fend for himself. He was careful never to let Bruno lose his wildness entirely, never to make him so tame that he couldn't survive on his own. It was, Elias would later say, the hardest kind of love there is, the kind that spends itself preparing to say goodbye. And the day came, as Elias knew it would. In the autumn of Bruno's second year, when the bear was nearly full grown, Elias took him deep into the forest one last time, to a good place near a salmon stream where a bear could make a life.
And there, with tears streaming down his weathered face, the old farmer said goodbye to the creature he loved. "Go on now, Bruno," he said, his voice breaking. "This is where you belong, out here, wild and free, the way you were always meant to be. Go on, live your life, be a bear." Bruno lingered, confused, pressing against the old man as he always had, but Elias steeled himself and turned and walked away and did not look back, because he knew if he looked back he'd never be able to leave. And when at last he reached the edge of the forest and did turn around, Bruno was gone, swallowed up by the wild, home. The old farmer walked back to his empty farm alone and grieved and told no one why. The years passed. Elias never saw Bruno again, though he thought about him every single day. He'd walk to the edge of the woods in the evenings and gaze into the trees, wondering if his old friend was out there somewhere, whether he'd survived, whether he was well. But the forest kept its secrets, and Bruno never came. Elias grew older and lonelier, and the ache of that goodbye never fully healed. He came to believe he would go to his grave never knowing what had become of the cub he'd raised and loved and let go. And he made his peace with that, the way he'd made his peace with so many other losses in his long life. Until one snowy morning, years later, when everything changed. Elias was an old man now, well into his 80s, frail and slow. He was standing at his kitchen window one bitter winter dawn, looking out at the snow-covered fields and the dark forest beyond, when he saw movement at the tree line, something large emerging from the woods. He squinted his old eyes, and his heart began to pound. It was a bear, a great full-grown black bear, walking slowly across the snowy field toward his farmhouse, and beside it, tumbling through the snow, were two small cubs. Elias's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. It had been so many years, and yet the way the bear moved, the way it came straight toward the house without fear, the way it stopped at the edge of the yard and lifted its great head and looked directly at the window where the old man stood, Elias knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. "Bruno," he whispered. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, the old farmer pulled on his coat and stepped out onto his porch into the freezing morning. Every ounce of sense told him to stay inside. A wild bear with cubs is among the most dangerous things in all the world, and he was a frail old man who could not run or defend himself. But Elias didn't feel fear. He walked down off his porch, out into the snow, toward the great bear and its cubs, and the bear did not charge, did not threaten. It simply stood there, watching him come, calm and still. Elias stopped a few feet away, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. "Bruno," he said again, softly, "is it really you, old friend, after all this time?" And the great bear made a low sound, a sound Elias hadn't heard in years but knew instantly, the same gentle rumbling sound Bruno had made as a cub, curled at Elias's feet by the fire. The bear stepped forward slowly and gently pressed its huge head against the old man's chest, the exact way it had as a cub. And Elias, weeping openly now, wrapped his frail arms around the massive creature and held him. This wild bear that was once a dying cub in the snow, come home across all the long years to see the man who had saved his life. Bruno had not forgotten, not the old man, not the farm, not the love that had pulled him back from the edge of death. And now in the twilight of the old man's life, he had come back one last time, not just to see Elias, but to show him something, to bring his own cubs, his family, his life that only existed because an old farmer chose compassion on sense on a cold spring morning long ago. It was, Elias understood, the greatest gift the bear could give. Bruno had come to show him that he had lived, that he had thrived, that the love Elias had spent letting her go had grown into a whole family, tumbling now through the snow of the old man's field. Bruno and her cubs stayed for hours that morning. The cubs, curious and unafraid, played in the snow around the old man, while her mother, for Bruno was a mother now, Elias realized, a female all along, dozed contentedly at his side, just as she had as a cub, and Elias sat in the snow with them, wrapped in a joy so deep it hurt, the loneliest man in Timber Falls, surrounded by the wild family that love had brought back to his door. By evening, as the light began to fade, Bruno rose. She nuzzled the old man one last time, gathered her cubs, and turned back toward the forest. At the tree line she stopped and looked back at Elias standing in his snowy field, one last long look between two old friends across all the years, and then she was gone, back into the wild, home. The old farmer walked back to his empty farm alone and grieved, and told no one why. The years passed. Elias never saw Bruno again, though he thought about him every single day. He'd walk to the